Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Keith Crumwoody, Dean of the Architecture Division at California College of the Arts. Thanks for joining us today for this double book launch from the Urban Works Agency, one of 4 research and teaching labs here at CCA Architecture. Before we begin, I'd like to share a land acknowledgement, which we at CCA understand to be a transformative act with which we confront our place on native lands and build mindfulness of our present participation in colonial legacies. California College of the Arts campuses are located in Huichin and Yelamu, also known as Oakland and San Francisco, respectively, on the unceded territories of the Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who have continuously lived upon this land since time immemorial. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in California and the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and culture. CCA honors Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those of the lands from which you're joining us virtually today. I'd also like to take a moment now to acknowledge the horrific recent events that remind us of the urgency of addressing the longstanding crises of racism and white supremacy in this country. The murders in Atlanta this past week of 8 people, including 6 Asian women, and the increasing number of anti-Asian attacks both here in San Francisco and across the country make clear that we must all raise our voices to condemn and denounce the racism and xenophobia that continue to plague our society. As a community, we stand in support and solidarity with our Asian and Asian American students, faculty, and staff. You deserve, as CCA President Steve Beal said in a message this week, to feel and to be safe, respected, and free from violence and hate. As a caring community, we extend compassion to those among us who are experiencing trauma or grief, and as creative citizens, we must each act with urgency to address and dismantle the complex systems of oppression that diminish us all. With today's event, we continue our Spring 2021 Architecture Lecture Series titled Remaking, through which we are reflecting upon the work we must do to remake our practices and co-imagine a just and equitable future for all. It's appropriate then that today we are celebrating the publication of 2 books from the Urban Works Agency, Apocalypse Now and Designing a Just City, that share inventive strategies through which the city can be reshaped as a commons from the ground up. The series continues next week. Please join us on Friday at noon as F. Jason Campbell, Kevin Moultrie-Day, Celeste Martor, and Brenda B. Zhang enter into a conversation with members of CCA chapter of the National Organization of Minority Architecture Students about their individual practices, their work as a collective space industries, and the use of architecture as a tool set for giving form, built or unbuilt, to inquiries into society and culture. To see the full spring lecture series, please visit scaffold.architecture.cca.edu, where you can also find recordings of our past events, along with stories by and about our students, faculty, alumni, and friends. And now I'll pass the screen to Janette Kim and Christopher Roach.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to welcome you to this event. And I have actually been really looking forward to this event for quite some time, because this is the kind of discussion that will bring together a series of conversations that have happened over the last year or so. So it's it's really exciting for me to see them kind of gain speed and even change direction. So thank you so much to our speakers. I'm really excited to hear your perspectives. I'm Janette Kim. I'm an assistant professor at CCA, and I co-direct at the Urban Works Agency with Niraj Bhatia, Antje Steinmiller, and Chris Roach, who I've organized today's event with. Special thanks to Keith Crumwoody and Sarah Mefta for making this event possible. Urban Works Agency is a research lab. It's also a postgraduate degree program and an undergraduate concentration here at CCA. And we ask how architects can engage with policy and activism and market forces in a way that can affect social justice and ecological vitality in cities. We're here today, as Keith mentioned, to celebrate the launch of 2 student books that poke at these very questions. One is called Apocalypse Now from Christina Cho-Yu and Chris Roach's Spring 2020 Advanced Architectural Studio. And the other is called Designing a Just City from my Spring 2020 Urban Elective Seminar called Urban Imaginaries. And as Keith mentioned, both of the books explore what it takes to make the city open. So open to interpretation, as well as self-determination, even open for business, as COVID has transformed cities so much, but indeed, especially as public space. So Chris and I will just give you a quick glimpse of the two books before the guest speakers join in. And this is Designing a Just City, How Architecture Reshapes Property, Equity, Economy, and Ecology. Oh, environment, sorry. As urban planning theorist Susan Feinstein has written, the idea of a just city counteracts the neoliberal concept of the prosperous city. So instead, a just city would reckon with the extractive and exploitative tendencies of urban development, and instead would prioritize fairness and equity. So this book contains 14 case studies from architecture and urban design to understand how they craft or sometimes even prevent this creation of a just city. We've organized the book in 4 chapters that point to techniques and narratives of resource distribution. So thus property, equity, environment, and economy. So property explores how land has been parceled, zoned, and reconfigured to create wealth and opportunity. Equity asks what it takes to redress the injustices of racial and class discrimination. Environment explores the social justice implications of natural resource use, ecosystem maintenance, and climate risk. And then lastly, economy asks how cities enable the distribution and consumption of capital through real estate development, neoliberal planning, labor, and work. So this book is very much a work in progress. Although I will give you the link to it in a moment. My current seminar is working on a second iteration of this book, in which we will also publish student interviews with social justice activists, and then draw out a toolkit of design strategies that can support their missions. So overall, our eventual goal is to reach an audience of both architects and activists, as well as policymakers, economists, and developers who also play a role in shaping cities very much. And we hope to establish a common language among these actors and work with them to reimagine the space of the city and to make urban resources available to those who need them most. Chris.
Hi, everyone. I'm Christopher Roach. I am a senior adjunct professor here at California College of the Arts and co-director of the Urban Works Agency with Janette, Niraj, and Antya. It's really my pleasure to be here today, and I'm also really excited to be co-hosting this event with Jeanette. And as she said, what's exciting about this is that I think this is an opportunity for conversations and discussions and design research that have been weaving throughout the Urban Works Agency studios and seminars over the past few years to culminate in a kind of point of discussion here today, and hopefully continue on into a broader discourse. So Apocalypse Now, project for the post-retail city, Rethinking the Ground Floor, investigates the so-called retail apocalypse as an opportunity to both rethink commercial environments and to experiment with new forms of property, governance, access, and space that can reshape their relationship to the public sphere. The book contains a series of rigorous case studies and design proposals which rethink the ground floor as a site for production and support of social infrastructure. And this research sprang from an interest in examining the ground floor of the city as kind of an entire urban entity, an object of research in its own right. It's followed on the heels of a series of urban design studios that I've been involved in, focusing more on housing, density, air rights, and generally what planners call vertical development. And through that, I became increasingly interested in more of the collective impact that current forms of fragmented property ownership and development have on the aggregate footprint of the city. So this kind of analytical turn towards the horizontal was the genesis of an idea for a new line of research focused on the ground floor itself. My colleague Christina Cho Yu had developed a similar interest in the decline of retail through her own work, working on Apple stores and seeing an evolution of retail away from being a place of purchasing of commodities. She saw great opportunity in retail's potential to instead become a catalyst for neighborhood activation and creating paradigm shifts, such as things like the 15-minute neighborhood. So these shared interests converged in the summer of 2019 when we teamed up to develop this advanced urban design studio focused on the retail apocalypse. And our intent was to develop an issues-based line of inquiry that would guide students through the research and analysis and develop expertise in the subject matter and process it through rigorous methods of representation and develop a thesis that could be tested on a series of sites in San Francisco. And our responses emerged from investigation into a series of global case studies analyzed through these 5 lenses of analysis, some of which kind of overlap with Jeanette's lenses from Designing a Just City. So ownership and capital, governance and programming, access and infrastructure, form and surface, and media and technology. And so through the research phase, we investigated how these hybrid public and commercial complex integrate flows of people, vehicles, goods, resources, and capital, and develop from these case studies a series of formal architectural solutions from applying the strategies and design models derived from the case studies to both the urban and the building scales. So ultimately, the studio focused on producing what we call the project for the city by applying and adapting these models to the conditions of a series of large development sites and existing commercial corridors in San Francisco. These sites were selected to include several new master plan developments, such as Treasure Island and Mission Rock, as well as existing commercial centers and neighborhood corridors to maximize opportunity for both new design and retrofit strategies, and to engage with the developers, retail experts, local government officials, and residents in these neighborhoods. The crux of this engagement was a workshop we ran at Spur called the Post-Retail City in the 4th week of the studio, and really brought the students together with these urban professionals working in this research space. And the hope was to produce work that was both academically ambitious, but would also bring the gravitas of this engagement with current issues and real places to make the work relevant and influence the discourse and rethinking of the ground floor. Then, of course, as the COVID-19 shelter in place descended on us, and our world changed quite drastically before our eyes. So before 2020, we decided at the last minute to name the studio Apocalypse Now as a kind of punchy way to grab attention and to generate discourse on the subject that we felt had been somewhat of a blind spot. And little did we know that this sort of somewhat of apocalypse would actually come to pass. So that's a good overview of the 2 books. And so what we're going to do is begin with a panel discussion about Apocalypse Now with our guests Carrie Denning Jackson, Ming Thompson, John Bela, Benjamin Grant, and my colleague Christina Cho Yu will be the moderator of that panel. Then we've asked María Arquero de Alarcón to serve as an interpreter of Designing the Just City by reflecting on its methods and terms from the vantage point of her work across architecture, landscape, and urbanism. And then we'll wrap up with a discussion involving all of these folks, and as well as the student authors of both publications. And we'll include a schedule in the bios of everyone in the chat.
Thanks, Chris. So we'll start the panel discussion now. And I have asked each of the panelists to kind of introduce themselves, but I feel really lucky to have them here because they're really impressive in their respective ways. And they were industry mentors or partners who provided our studio and our students with really invaluable input. And strangely enough, they're joining us from both coasts, 50-50. I believe last time I checked, John and Ben were local, and Ming and Carrie are on the East Coast in New Haven and New York. So why don't I just go down the line and have you all introduce yourselves? We'll start with Carrie.
Sure. And do you also want to do what excites us about what's going on?
Yeah, and then just to mix it up, I forgot to mention that is there some creative or unexpected way you've seen cities or retail pivot or innovate during this time, or anything that you just wanted to share, kind of following your involvement in the studio?
Great. And it was wonderful to be involved. So I'm Carrie Denning Jackson. I'm a director on the development team at Sidewalk Labs. We're based in New York City. We're an alphabet company that's focused on urban innovation. And our development team works with select developers to integrate urban innovation into their projects to help them achieve their ambitious environmental, social, and economic goals. So a lot of stuff. What excites me actually, and I'll be really brief because I know there's others, but is I think what COVID revealed in a big way that we all know is a lot of the complete injustice, geographic, institutional, policy-wise, that persists in our cities and our communities. And so what I think that it's really interesting, and the Just City conversation later will obviously talk more on it, is just there's a huge reckoning in the real estate industry that's occurring right now. And I can go into it later in the panel, but I think that's encouraging and it's a big shift. So that's what I would say.
Ben?
Hi, my name is Ben Grant. Until recently, I spent about 12 years at Spur, San Francisco urban policy think tank, most recently as the urban design policy director. So thinking about the implications for urban design, physical planning, and place of policy issues. First, I want to give a huge shout out to the CCA crew and Urban Works for this incredibly timely and interesting work. It was timely and interesting before COVID, and it only became more urgent as the year progressed. So it's been exciting to be a part of this. And I also want to give a shout out to Christy Wong from Spur, who did a lot of the initial contact and convening, including that workshop that I kind of came to as a guest facilitator and was like, wow, this is so cool. I want to be more involved in this. Obviously the context of the retail apocalypse is so urgent right now. And in terms of what excites me that's going on right now, I would say the sort of rapid progress in reconceptualizing the use of the public realm, which has obviously been brewing for quite some time in the field in a lot of cities, but really went into overdrive, and a lot of really terrific folks in city staffs took a very fast and dramatic look at kind of the regulatory landscape and how we enable and prohibit things to happen in cities. And I think, within the broader context of all of the suffering and all of the challenges that we're facing, I think a real bright spot is the use of the public realm by retail and the adaptability that cities have shown under this duress.
Me?
Hi, my name is Ming Thompson. I'm principal of Atelier Cho Thompson with my partner, Christina Cho Yu. And I've very eagerly followed the development of the studio over the past years, and thankful to be here today. So Christina and I run a practice, a small practice really embedded in our communities. And I think I'm here today as someone who's really working on the ground with cities that are trying to figure out how we get through COVID, with business owners that are trying to figure out how their businesses stay alive during this time. And so I think being where the rubber hits the road, we're seeing how a lot of these things are playing out in the real lives of humans. And one project that we're really excited about right now, it's not a project with a client, but it's a project we're working on with students. This past summer, we set up a program called Design Brigade to connect students to real world problem solving in the time of COVID. One of our groups was tasked with coming up with a memorial to COVID for the city of New Haven. And over the past year, we've really seen that project pivot from memorial to a tool for healing and engaging communities. So they're about to launch the first part of their project, which is an interactive art piece where people kind of look back at what's happened to them and look forward to what's coming in the future. And by sharing their individual experiences in a collective way, we're trying to bring people back together as a tool of healing and a tool of rebirth in our communities. So that's one thing we're excited about right now.
Thanks, Ming. John?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to be here today. I'm a partner and director with Gail and also founder of Rebar, the art and design studio. I was going to talk about in terms of what excites me, that's happened over the last year or so, about how, some of the projects that we were working on with cities throughout the Bay Area that would normally be moving quite slowly in terms of, public space investment and pedestrianization were really unlocked, I think, through having a whole new set of advocates, including the small business community, for which I think a lot of these projects are intended to serve. But in hearing the discussion today, I think that the true thing, I think, is the lesson for me over the last year is the role that our streets play in democracy. And the fact that a lot of the open streets movement, all the investment in public realm, combined with what we're seeing in terms of people occupying streets to address systemic racism, to address the fundamental inequity in which people are able to actually show up in public space, to me is the biggest lesson from 2020, that we have a long way to go. And yet, it's a powerful lesson at the important role that public space and streets plays in our lives, and the fundamental role that it plays in democratic discourse in the country.
Wow, I'm really glad I asked that question. That was really interesting. And I'm just going to really quickly go down the line. And we asked our industry partners to write forewords for each of the student proposals. And so John wrote a foreword for the work from home neighborhood proposal that Marie and Alita did on Treasure Island. Carrie wrote in response to Donna and James's Mission Rock proposal and how it proposed flexible spaces and authentic placemaking. And Ben wrote a response to the Excelsior project by Sharon and Elmer about cities really being in crisis before this time, but all the more now, and the heightened importance of policy as the pandemic has just really amplified this or accelerated this retail apocalypse. Ming wrote on issues of equity in response to Juan and Xiao's India Basin project. And I think the cool thing about the equity piece is that it relates to what Jeanette is going to get into. It also relates to part 2 of our studio that Chris and Julia Greencook are now doing in the current semester. And with everything going on in the world, it's just a really important topic to discuss. So I'm excited about that. So I prepared some questions for each of our panelists, and I'll give a little quick summary of some of the things that our panelists wrote about, and kind of have some follow-up questions that I had. And so John, I'll start with you. You quoted an article by Lawrence Wright, who said that a post-COVID world would offer an opportunity for radical change, kind of like the time of cultural renewal after the Middle Ages. And I personally noticed amongst my clients that there are certain people who are like waiting for us to just bounce back to the status or the pre-COVID status quo, and then others who really are thinking forward and thinking that their lives and the world is going to fundamentally change. And I think in the Bay Area we have a lot of tech workers who can work from home, and a lot of companies who are saying that they can indefinitely to a much greater extent than they did before. But I'm wondering, like, outside of the Bay Area, have you been seeing, or even like across the world, have you been seeing like varying responses to how our cities and our buildings will be changing in response to this increase in work from home?
Yeah, that's a great question. And while GEL as an urban design practice does work globally, I'm kind of focused on the West Coast of Canada and the US and the Americas, Latin America, Central and South America. And, you know, one thing I alluded to in the intro that I wrote and I've been thinking about continues to be striking to me is lessons from the Bay Area. You know, I think about the Salesforce Tower, for instance. I've been thinking about the Salesforce Tower compared to Torre David, you know, which is the one of the largest buildings in South America that ended up being occupied as an informal settlement in the late 90s and you know, provided informal housing for 3,000 people until it was abandoned a couple of years ago. Salesforce Tower is a 1.4 million square feet, sitting largely vacant, you know, but it's really only, you know, there's 12 million square feet of vacant office space in San Francisco currently. That represents 9 Salesforce towers, to visualize that for a second, of vacancy just in San Francisco. And that represents about 70 to 90,000 workers, which is just astonishing. If you think about the size of an average 1-bedroom in San Francisco, just for a thought experiment here, it's about 700 square feet. Let's imagine that some percentage of that space might be converted to a use like housing through some kind of tax incentive program. 12 million square feet of vacant space could equal 17,000 housing units. I know this is just a sort of a big picture thought experiment. Thinking about the future of work from home, you know, I think a good compass or indicator is what some of our major employers in the Bay Areas are saying and thinking. And you know, Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Alphabet companies, is, you know, they've just announced that Google is going to be investing $7 billion in new office space across the US, but that for them that means 10,000 jobs. So it's a drop in the bucket even to what the sort of jobs gap is in San Francisco currently. Nonetheless, you know, Sundar says that Google has dismissed the idea of permanent remote work, but they're promoting the idea of the flexible work week. So, you know, maybe employees may be required to come to the office 3 days a week. So just percentage wise, that means that there may be 40% underutilized or vacant space in buildings long term we're talking about. So now if I apply that 40% of unutilized space to the 12 million square feet of vacant office space in San Francisco, that could literally translate to about 6,800 housing units. Now, I know you're saying that's not really possible, JB, but it turns out there's historic precedent for converting commercial to residential, for office to residential conversions. In 1990s, Midtown Manhattan, I think you probably know the story, the 421G program created a series of tax breaks that have actually enabled the creation of 25,000 housing units in Midtown Manhattan and global or nationally. There's been Class B and C office conversions have resulted in about 96,000 housing units have been created. And so what if, I like the what if here, and I think this could be a great studio topic actually for CCA. Let's do an analysis of what of the types, what building floor plate, building types in our CBD in San Francisco are actually capable of being converted to something like housing, and what would a tax incentive program really need to look like in order to enable those conversions, and what does that mean then for a CBD, which has generally been like a 9 to 5, you know, public life profile, dead after 5 p.m. to become a vibrant mixed-use neighborhood, which is what's happened in Lower Manhattan. And then what does that mean for actually the neighborhoods where people are now working from home and the services that are required to support that distributed office space network actually throughout San Francisco and Bay Area neighborhoods? It's an incredible thought experiment, great studio topic, and kind of an amazing opportunity, I think, ahead of us to explore the likelihood of some of these changes actually resonating over the next 10 to 15 years throughout the Bay Area.
Thanks, John. That's staggering statistics. And I think that's a really good segue to some questions I wanted to ask Carrie, because John has these kind of like bigger picture thoughts, and then kind of at the scale of a neighborhood or a building, Carrie can kind of talk more about like the real estate model that could make these conversions a reality, or conversions, or I don't know, swing spaces or whatnot. But so, Carrie, you wrote about how the real estate business model needs to change to avoid all of these empty storefronts. And you advocated for flexibility and also an ease for businesses to launch on the ground floor, and said that it would actually benefit all the parties, the landlord, the business, and even the community. So now that we've been so focused on the retail apocalypse, but that's now been exacerbated by an increase from work from home. So not only is the ground floor in question and in jeopardy, but now we don't know what's going on above that. And so I was wondering if you'd seen some creative or innovative solutions or proposals to tackle both at once, maybe an operating model that allows some sort of flexibility on both ground and upper floors. And would an increase in work from home kind of change what should be happening on the ground floor, just because people will be more out and about in their neighborhoods now during?
Yeah, I mean, those are hard. That's a hard question. And it's interesting. I think a lot of the things John mentioned, like I agree with completely. And just stepping back on the work from home piece. So it's interesting, like in the early 2000s, the .com era, there was a lot of talk about people working from home forever and never going to an office, and the death of the city. And we didn't see that happen. In fact, cities became, even greater. Young people flocked to cities. And so I think there is a kind of a similar thing happening here, where there's a lot of, it's not techno-utopianism in this case, but it's a lot of crystal ball thinking of, our staff will always be remote. And like, I just learned a bit about the remote Tulsa project, where Tulsa, the city, is actually paying people to $10,000 to relocate, and doing an excellent job at it, but under the auspices that people can work remotely, and that will be a thing. But I think what John kind of was alluding to is like, there's more of a hybridization that will likely happen. And just an anecdote from my own life, I was a remote worker at IBM in my early 20s when they decided to not have offices. And for a new employee, for a younger person, it's really terrible for a culture. And so I just don't see, I see there being this hybrid thing going on, and definitely young people still flocking to cities because that's where they meet each other. That's where they go out. That's where they do things. And so I think that still will remain the case. But for families, young families, the flexibility of a hybrid model, I think, is invaluable. And families, I've seen it amongst my peer group, an acceleration of moving to the suburbs, and that's happening. And so what John mentioned and what you were also discussing is what is the urbanization of the suburbs, and how is that happening, and what kind of amenities will exist in the suburbs? And we're talking with a couple big mall operators right now about, this is happening, but repositioning mall assets and moving away from them being totally retail to mixed use, and adding residential and a lot of health spaces, and absolutely community and cultural spaces. So basically, I'm adding on to what John was saying, not answering your question, but so to dive into your question about the architectural piece, I think it's going to be very, very challenging, because when I was talking about ground floor, the idea was, okay, can you offer more short-term licenses, aka pop-ups, to get folks in, especially people who wouldn't normally do brick and mortar, and they can try it, see if it works, and then leave. And it's low risk for them, it's low risk for the landlord. And there was also discussion that we've been having around how can landlords better get a piece of the online sales that do occur because they are acting as a physical billboard for a product. So you're seeing that with ground floor and some of that flexibility, and like that would be the far off North Star case. With office, it's interesting, like the use case you're mentioning is co-working. That's essentially what it is. It's a flexible model where there's built-in amenities. It's building as an office as an experience. But I think it's really challenging with companies like my own company, or architecture firms, you name it. Like, there's privacy issues, there's stuff in the office. Like, you can't just move building plans, models, things like that, and flex in and out. So I think you ask a big question. I don't have an answer to it. I think the operating model is co-working, but I don't know how it works for larger companies beyond reducing their floor plan and seeing more hybrid work. And I just leave it with, I think this will have profound effects for the CBD, Central Business District, just given the amount of workers, ancillary workers that support that constant 9 to 5 work schedule that we have. So I'll end it there.
Yeah, no, really good thoughts. I mean, I love the idea of short-term licenses for pop-ups. I mean, as someone walking down the street in my neighborhood, it would just keep things really fresh. But then I'm thinking, like, what's the incentive for the landlord to do that? Because why wouldn't I just give it to Compass Realty or, you know, some bank that I don't have to worry about for 10 years, you know? And I'm wondering if there's an incentive policy-wise, or maybe I'm like creating my own segue to Ben right now, or financially somehow, maybe it is that getting a piece of the online sales or something like that. I mean, do you have any thoughts of things people have done or cities have done?
I think some cities are trying to incentivize it by penalizing vacancies. And Ben and others would probably know more about this from a policy perspective, but that's one way. A lot of pop-ups work very well when there's just ongoing vacancy, and it's a win for the landlord because they get revenue in the door. But yes, it does require a more creative thinking landlord who's willing to take the operational risk on the pop-up versus holding out for a longer term tenant.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, that's a perfect segue to Ben, because I think right now city's policy is playing such a huge role in maintaining some vitality to our streets. And so in your essay, you talk about how retail provides essential services. It's a mechanism for economic opportunity, that retail is culture. So you're saying that retail just represents so many important things in our cities, and cities have really had to scramble to come up with some kind of policy to help these businesses survive when people can't come into their doors. And so what are some of the measures here or elsewhere that have emerged during this time that have worked or not worked or been abused, or kind of the gamut?
Sure. So taking a step back to start with, and then I'll kind of step into the direct answer to that. As you started to allude to in the question, I got very interested in sort of why retail is special, why the preoccupation with retail. And I'm first because it has been in decline for some time. But it has other kind of special facets that are not just about whether it's thriving or not, that are implicated in sort of the civic life of the city. I wanted to start with a reflection. Recently, I drove across the Bay Bridge and saw about a dozen super tankers stacked with containers. And I was reflecting on, what if you could sort of have X-ray vision and see what was in those tankers? And of course, it's not tankers, transport ships, cargo ships. And it's so many different facets of the stuff of our society, right? But among other things is probably the contents of every Target and Walmart store in the region, stacked up, sitting in the bay, waiting its turn to offload those containers and move those manufactured goods, primarily from China, into our consumer economy. And I reflect on that just by way of thinking about this question of the special role of retail, and how we have an idealized conception of what retail is like in the city that is really rooted in the kind of Jane Jacobs sort of valorization of the traditional urban fabric and getting those basic services met. But the truth is, how we spend our dollars on more practical facets of our lives is usually we're buying sort of manufactured plastic crap from large chain stores. And when we talk about retail and when we talk about sort of the special position of retail, we need to be very thoughtful about the spatial expression of that and the sort of idealized version of it versus the reality, where we vote with our dollars versus what we feel close to in our hearts, and what plays a special role in the civic and cultural life of the city. You know, I would ask some provocative questions like, does it matter enormously if we get our plastic crap from China from a big box store versus in a box on our front porch versus at a much larger markup from a local retailer who is inhabiting a place that a community that we live in? And how meaningful is that if you follow the supply chain back to the sort of global economy that is a portal into? But certainly there are lots of types of retail and lots of aspects of retail that are really important to the life of the city. And I think it's one of the fundamental questions in urban design and the architectural expression of urbanism, of how that experience inhabits the city. What's the spatial footprint? And of course, the traditional and much beloved version of that is that Jane Jacobs vision of the city street. And a lot of preoccupation on the part of urban designers and developers has gone into, geez, retail is really struggling. How do we make sure that the container on the ground floor of the building is the right shape and size and has the right equipment? How do we get that into codes to make sure that we can attract retail, that retail can thrive in these spaces? And yet still the world is full of brand new buildings that are denser and more urban and in the right kinds of locations that are lined with empty retail. It is a chronic ongoing problem. And part of that is that we over provide retail in new development, right? We have this cartoon of like, oh, urban equals, you know, office or housing upstairs and ground floor retail, a cafe on the ground floor. You cannot put a ground floor, you cannot put a cafe on the ground floor of every single building, right? And if you think about the traditional cities that cartoon is derived from, whether it's New York or Paris or London, you have actually block after block after block of single-use districts backing these retail centers where the ground floors are activated. So that is I think, a little bit of a romantic fantasy we need to get over, and we need to think about placing retail in the right places. And then also I would just reflect that for all of the energy we put into putting big, tall, open, transparent retail spaces in the ground floor of buildings, where people really want to be, you have things appear like a cafe that's in 100 square feet, that someone just tucks it in. I've seen a noodle shop that is in the ground floor of a garage in Seattle that the entire retail space is 6 feet deep. It doesn't meet any of the criteria that we as architects and urban designers would want, but somebody made a very creative use of that space, and they had a use that was desired that had a market for it. So the importance of the spatial container is very complicated and very nuanced. And just because you have the right space doesn't mean you get the retail. And retail can inhabit a lot of different kinds of spaces. One thing that you've seen an ongoing conversation about in planning and policy is what constitutes an appropriate use in the ground floor. And there are a lot of rules about, well, we don't just want, you know, bank branches or social service agencies or offices or even residences in our storefronts. We want to make sure they're active uses, which is a totally laudable goal that is reflective of that special function of retail lining the street. But you see people rethinking that in a hurry right now under COVID, for example, trying to then broaden the range of permissible uses and say, we want to, you know, let 1,000 flowers bloom in these spaces so that things are happening and there's flexibility and ease. So that question of like what constitutes an active use, what constitutes a kind of civically virtuous function for that space that will bring the public realm to life and bring pedestrian traffic and so forth. Our perspective on that changes depending on the conditions. We want to cultivate that space, but we don't want to, you know, so we want to insist on the right kinds of uses, but we also don't want empty spaces, and we often find ourselves stuck with them. So to kind of wend my way back to your actual question, as I alluded to in the first comments, I think the use of the public realm is probably the most exciting venue for for innovation in response to COVID, and the speed with which cities kind of kicked into gear to really re-examine, in particular, the kind of regulatory burden, which is a phrase that like progressives tend to be horrified by because it's like, oh my God, are we like Republicans? But in fact, from the user's point of view, in particular, if you're talking about a low-income user or an entrepreneur or an immigrant family or somebody with language barriers and so forth, it's actually tremendously onerous to get permission to do what seem like very basic things. And so as much as temperamentally I'm a fan of putting guardrails around the marketplace, the reality is that if you have to go from agency to agency and get your building inspection permit and your business license and your health inspection and your liquor license, and it's all separate and it's all different fees and the policies don't align and so forth, that actually can be super punishing and has a real equity dimension to it. When things get tricky, the people that are going to get squeezed out are the people that have the least resources and the least capacity to cope with that kind of bureaucratic nonsense, frankly. And one thing that I have seen that's very exciting is actually within planning and permitting departments, you have people rapidly cutting through a lot of this red tape and saying, we're going to have one-stop permitting. We're going to create policies where we have default approvals, where we sort of assume that you are following the regulations in good faith, and we can do enforcement later if you're not actually doing it. But rather than putting the onus on the entrepreneur to prove to the city that they are doing things right before they can start doing something. And that extends to things like flexibility on liquor sales, being able to sell cocktails to go. Sidewalk seating has long been this like ridiculous bureaucratic nightmare to get approved, to put a couple tables and chairs out, which everybody says is exactly what we want to have happening in our cities. And, the more salient recent example, of course, is parklets and the use of the roadway and the street, which often required significant long processes and fees to accomplish. And cities like Oakland and San Francisco have made tremendous headway in easing that, waiving fees, making the permitting much more permissive with respect to use of the public realm. And that also goes for permitting of uses, providing waivers for temporary uses, providing waivers for from what would now require a conditional use permit. Like, for example, there's a
don't call them parklets though; they're more like shoplets.
That's right.
Fulfilling
that's
their
actually an important
obligation.
That's a really important question. I'm glad you raised that because traditionally, for example, in San Francisco, it was a core principle of parklets that they are public space and cannot be exclusive to the adjacent business. In San Jose, by contrast, they could be exclusive dining for the adjacent restaurant. Different conception of what that thing is. I think with the recognition of the tenuousness of retail businesses and the desire of cities to keep local businesses alive, the kind of doctrine around that has shifted, right? And it is much more comfortable to say, look, small local businesses have a kind of civic value to them, even though they are profit-seeking entities at the end of the day. Maybe it is okay to allow business activity in what had been conceived of as a purely sort of public open space type context. And that, it's interesting to see how we shift our attitudes about these things as conditions change. And I just want to close with the thought that as much as there's a really interesting bunch of innovations going on, and this particularly underscoring this idea of defaulting to yes, that like it's permitted unless you're screwing something up, rather than having to jump through 1,000 hoops to finally get your permission at the end. You assume sort of bad faith on the part of the actor, even though most of these regulations are with the best of intentions with respect to health and nuisance and so forth. It adds up to a lot. But I just wanted to close with the thought that none of this constitutes success in the sense that what the exercise right now is about is stopping the bleeding and mitigating the harm of this incredibly traumatic period that we're all living through. So no matter how successful these things are, it's really measured against lessening the harm rather than really achieving the kinds of cities that we want to achieve over the long haul. And as this immediate crisis starts to fade away, the question becomes, what can we carry with us? What lessons can we take from this that create a more sort of just and engaging city in the future?
Thanks so much, Ben. Yeah, I mean, if there are any silver linings to this time, streamlining of these processes is a really good takeaway. And I think also retail is probably a bit of a restrictive term to use for the ground floor. And I love that you're talking about active use. And I think that's a really good segue to Ming now, because if our ground floor is supposed to be a lot more, or can be a lot more than that, can it address issues of equity? And I think Ming's essay in particular was a really great prelude to our next studio, which our current studio, which Chris and Julia are teaching. Also, you know, our studio happened, and the pandemic happened in the middle of our studio. Then at the end of our studio, the George Floyd incident happened. We saw an upsurge of BLM protests, then all the drama around the election, and then in today's, today we're hearing about all of this anti-hate action, all these hate crimes happening. And so I think this year's studio is very, in a timely way, addressing the role of the ground floor in producing social infrastructure that can provide people with, or hook them up with better social capital that can help them through day-to-day life, but also through difficult times. And so there's this thought that they're entertaining that the cities perhaps should subsidize or help better support this kind of ground floor to be an ecology for this social infrastructure that benefits the common good and doesn't leave it up just to market forces. So Ming, what are your thoughts on how all of this should play out for our cities today?
I'm always forgetting the mute button. So just for some context, I'm calling in from the city of New Haven. I don't know if there are any other New Haven people on the phone right now. But New Haven is it's a great city. It's a vibrant city. And like a lot of other post-industrial cities, it suffers from great problems of inequality. And I mean, that plagues San Francisco as well. But in New Haven, I'm part of a lot of grassroots organizations. So I kind of like to approach this question from a grassroots standpoint. So much of the conversations around innovation always center back to San Francisco or center back to New York and center to people in their 20s who are working at tech companies. But I think, in this, as a part of this conversation, there's innovation happening in every town and in this country. And there's, in particular, innovations responding to COVID, responding to the death of retail, and responding to inequality that I think are part of this conversation. So here in New Haven, I see an incredible number of really active, really vibrant citizens who are trying to figure out how to make the world better. And those are people who have 9-to-5 jobs, they work 3 jobs, they have kids, but they're part of communities that have deep histories and deep cultures, and they need government to work for them. And they need to find pathways, whether that's through monetary support or through, the breaking down of some of the arduous requirements of the city to make their dreams happen. And so, I mean, as you all know, it's, for those of you who own small businesses, it's hard to be a small business owner in this country. And, if this is what the market has done to us, it's easier to get our packages in the mail from Amazon, but the emptying of downtowns, retail is not just about selling something, but it's about life on the street, about the way a well-loved storefront interacts with the street in front of it, the way people can spend time in front of a retail location, and about building a really vibrant community outside your house and in your neighborhood. And so I wanted to look at a couple examples that I thought were working really well in New Haven, that were kind of innovation around equity and around ground floor. The first one sort of related to what Ben said already. And I just wanted to add a comment on, we get to be part of some really fun projects with the city of New Haven. They're rolling out a big project of outdoor dining this week. Not only are they breaking down some of the regulatory boundaries, they really thought about, they took an equity lens to the process and thought about what are all the pinch points of permitting that are preventing our restaurants from having outdoor dining. So they have a live video you can watch of how to fill out the permit. They have much deeper training for the staff, because honestly, staff weren't giving people straight answers. You all have faced this in permits as well. And creating transparency around the whole process. And then the biggest thing is that there's money to back this up. They're providing actual funding to people for both interior and exterior improvements. And that, above anything, I think is going to make this process roll out in the city. So that's from the public perspective. And from the private perspective, one project that we've been lucky to be part of here is kind of aligning, looking at the ground floor of the city through the arts. And this is a project called Next Haven, which I'll drop into the chat in just a minute. And thinking about using art, the making of art, looking at art, experiencing art as a catalyst for equity and as a catalyst for enlivening the ground floor of the city. So Next Haven essentially is it's an arts model that is focused on artists of color and curators of color. It gives fellows a place to work. It gives them an education around how the market works, how to get gallery representation, and folds in aspects of the local community. So Next Haven's located in a part of New Haven called Dixwell, which is a historically Black neighborhood. At the beginning of the 19th century, it was a prosperous neighborhood, a wonderful legacy of jazz and arts. And over time, it's become a more and more impoverished neighborhood. It's predominantly a Black neighborhood, and together two artists decided that they wanted to take an abandoned ground floor space in a factory building and turn this into a location for this project. So they this is sited on a corner. They've created a beautiful glass storefront in a neighborhood where people say it's, it's not where you would expect a museum to go in New Haven, but it's a collision between street culture and museum culture, between a globally recognized group of artists and a local community, between high school students and MacArthur Genius Prize winners, sharing the space together. And the founder once said to me, in neighborhoods like ours and neighborhoods with economic challenges, people usually give us something that's just good, but we don't deserve good. We all deserve the best. We deserve the best architecture. We deserve the best art. We deserve the best programming. And they see their place on the ground floor as a way to have the community interact with this vision that they have. And it's possible because of state and local funding that they've rallied around. And it's been a kind of a transformative thing in this neighborhood that we're seeing have impacts across the city. So that's, I think, one example of, I think in this time of COVID, I've seen there's a vacuum for people who have great ideas and a vacuum for people to step into to make really positive change in their communities across the country. So I'm hopeful. Thanks, Christina.
Yeah, thanks, Ming. And thanks to everyone for your really amazing thoughts. I was taking notes vigorously. But if anyone has any questions, please drop them in the chat. Even if Maria is going to speak next, give her thoughts on the second publication. But don't be shy about dropping in some questions in there, because at the end of this whole thing, we're going to have a Q&A time. So Maria, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you, Jeanette, and thank you, Christopher, for this invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. I'm a fan, number one, of the work that you are doing at the Urban Works Agency. So being able to be here today and discuss a book that is also part of the conversations that you are having in your seminars and your studios is simply a treat. So I'm gonna share my screen. Let's see how that works and share with you a little bit of what I've been. There we go. The ways in which I took this opportunity to reflect on this fantastic book, Designing a Just City, and also as an opportunity to look at obviously at home my own work is, is plain and is in a way grappling with very similar issues. So let's see if this is a good way for me to drive you through the work. So my name is María Arquero de Alarcón, and I'm professor at the University of Michigan at Tubman College. I'm going to be sharing with you work that aligns and I think helps offer other approaches to the topics that the book is inserting. And I like to always start with something that is very important for the work that I do, and is in a way aligning with the way in which I see you working too. In all the projects that I've been participating in the last few years, there is a wide range of geographies, of themes, of intentions and aspirations, but there is also some of the most talented younger generations of designers that are students. And I want to start today recognizing the incredibly provocative work that Lacon, James, Pietro, Salim, she, Jennifer, Thomas, Lori, Donna, Kurt, Sharon, Sajer, Jose, Elmer, and Carlos have been developing. I think this is incredibly important and inspiring because this is work that is happening in a seminar. And we tend to think that studios are always the places where speculation can happen with more depth. And it's a real joy to see that in this seminar there are many of the threads that I'm imagining students taking forward. So I'm going to start doing something that Jeanette already did at the beginning, but just in case you connected later, this is how I went through the book, and this is important for me then to be able to share how I was reflecting in my own production. The work is very clear, in my opinion, extending an invitation. It's a book that is interested in forming coalitions, in bringing people closer to define common projects. I think there are very clear premises. Obviously, designing a just city is not an easy thing to do, but the book is very clear that first and foremost, there needs to be a redefinition of prosperity, and there needs to be an opportunity for design to be truly centered in achieving a more pluralistic society. There is a lot in the book that speaks on tools for persuasion and for influencing the many very, very layered and variegated logics behind power in the city. But there is also a fair amount of thinking on other work that is happening through more tactical knowledge, very much aspiring to collaborate with communities and build on the knowledge that they have. And then last but not least, the book is inviting architects and urban designers, but I would also say partners in crime and enablers of this work. And this is, once again, really, really important. This is a case study book and is, in a way, unfolding in a very interesting way, a conversation about work. As I always do, when I go through a book, I draw a mental map. And this is what you can see in the book. 4 larger themes, 14 different case studies. But there is not only this, there is a lot of work that is being done trying to establish a conversation in between these cases. There is an analytical lens that talks about density, opportunity, freedom, dignity, legibility, how we build the territory, aesthetics, value, how we define other kinds of resources beyond the monetary. And it's not only the linear logic that is shown in here. It would have gone very, very complicated if I would start to cross-reference the many, many ways in which we see how the projects are insinuating through color coding and other means, how every project can actually be read and discussed in many different ways. So this is a little bit how I would like to take this conversation, because while going through the incredibly rich conversation that, as I say, many of these projects are opening up, these are some of the lines that were in a way lingering a little bit longer with me. how, when we talk about property, there is really an aspiration to discuss how we can frame alternative land tenure models. When we talk about equity, how we are actually enabling the co-production and the forming of coalitions in this important work redistributing resources and capacities. Ecology is all about balancing risks and benefits and what that means for us today at this very moment in which, you know, we are still hurting with the pandemics, and as the panelists in the previous session were discussing the many other crises. And at the same time, you know, we look at economy with an opportunity to maybe define alternative value systems. And then I started to think on the opportunity to, you know, to see how these larger ambitions are asking us to be disruptive, to be advocates, to engage in organization at the community level, to empower our collaborators, to be real stewards of the land, to cultivate new meanings and new understandings on how to truly protect our shared resources, and also to hack and to activate. I speak as an academic, and it's always an opportunity. It's always a unique position that we have to be able to operate with a different kind of time, right? With a kind of patience and with the opportunity to truly establish long partnerships. And all this comes together to some of the ways in which, after, you know, examining many of these themes and you know, grappling with them, some of the ways in which I'm going to be discussing 3 of the projects in which we have been working recently, and just to give you a sense of how much I think the work is trying to offer ways of acting. It's a book about actionable capacities. So in the work that I'm going to be sharing with you, you are going to see a little bit how we are trying to challenge how policy and the legal system is in many cases working to reinforce the status quo, how we address times, the many different times of us in academia, our students, our partners, how we engage in the design of processes, how we work with activists, and how we bring design to the service of larger agendas, how we are very much learning on how to co-learn and how to develop more compelling stories about the struggles of our partners, and last but not least, how we are actually able to distribute the sources and the resources that we have access to, so that we can do a little bit of our, you know, our own contribution to many of these conversations. And as I say, these are going to be 3 very, very good projects that I'm not going to explain in full detail, but just to give you a sense of how many moments of overlap and how much this struggle for the just city is actually a global struggle. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Detroit, and this is a city very close to where I live. And in Detroit, we have been looking at one of the many legacies that the city is grappling with. And one of these legacies is actually dealing with vacancy. And in the project that we have been developing, we were very much interested in looking at what happens in these areas that many of the philanthropy-driven master plans are defining as prone for ecological and productive futures. Where are these areas in the city, these neighborhoods coming from? Where are they going? And as you can see here, we use a lot of cartographic studies to be able to understand how the reality that we live today is a clear, direct legacy of the past, and how we are going to be projecting equally problematic utopias if we don't carefully assess our work. So much of what we see now with these conversations about the productive and the ecological are actually coming from, you know, previous policies at the federal level that were actually dealing with the redlining effects. And it's very easy for you to see the correlation of what are some of these areas with higher rates of vacancy that are actually coming from some of these previous policies in which a lot of lack of investment was put in place. So we have been looking at 3 specific neighborhoods with higher rates of vacancy that can go anywhere from 60 to 80%. This is all the building stock that has been lost. And I just, I just want to share with you the scale is it's really nerve-wracking, but there are many different ways of looking at this. And particular here, I want to share with you the way in which vacancy is being counted and the way in which important stakeholders in the process of stewarding a different future for the city is actually accounting for. These are the pro formas that the Detroit Land Bank develops to be able to account for the land that they own, the problems that that land has, and what are the strategies that they see to dispose of that land quickly. Obviously, this is very different than the way in which scholars are looking at some of these legacies. And, we look at colleagues like Joshua Akers for a long time, looking at land speculation and the very processes that are creating the situation that Detroit is confronting today, and how he very much talks about not an outcome, but a process that is still playing. The three neighborhoods could be many more, but this is just to give you a sense. The work happens in conversation with many of the residents, the landowners, policymakers, and it's fascinating for us to see how residents understand very well that the land is the most important resource that they have. And you see how one of the residents was telling us, well, we got the land, but we mismanaged it. How many cars do you think were made last year? 100,000? How much land was made last year? None. So they very much understand that land is one of the most important resources, and it continues to be mismanaged in the promise of a prosperity that is always, to the benefit of those with the availability of capital to be able to invest in the city. Residents are also understanding that, as Amos was telling us, that Detroit is a city with many stories at the same time. And what you're seeing here is a conversation about gentrification and communification. And again, this is about understanding how capital continues to develop parts of the city, and how in other parts of the city, he acknowledges that is human spirit. It's about, work that is happening through different coalitions of long-term residents and organizations to be able to remain in place. Last but not least, the way in which obviously the municipality is looking at the land and is looking at the highest stock of vacant land, and how they are actually recognizing that the only way in which neighborhood planning can actually happen is actually investing in ways in which tax return will be possible. And this is important because these are the conversations that are, as of now, situated in the city, and in a way, negotiating very different imaginations of what the future may be. In this understanding of how the city is being produced, we have been for a long time looking at how different processes of what we call, and that was the title of this particular project, illegal, informal, irregular urbanization, are actually perhaps the fastest and more pervasive way of developing urban land in many cities in the global south. And in this case, we were looking at one particular area in the outskirts of Mexico City that has been developed completely through processes of illegal urbanization. And looking back at this project as a response to what the book is presenting was interesting, because this is a project that is in a way bringing us to a city that has now the same population that the city of Detroit. But as you can imagine, while the city of Detroit has been shrinking and resources have been dwindling, here for years, the population has been consolidating and has been implementing the city. And it has been doing so through a very interesting approach, through the deployment of grids. And this is interesting because we normally, and this was something that was very evident in the book, we look at the grid as one of the many ways of deploying power, of urbanizing. And in this case, it was very interesting to see how these organizations that are housing movements, many of them with a Marxist political motivation, are actually seizing the land and are deploying all kinds of facilities and strategies using the grid as a strategy to control and to develop the land. And much of what you're seeing here are the different ways in which we were interested in reading what are these mechanisms that they actually use to deploy different services, not only housing, but actually schools, health centers, how they provide for themselves, but how they also establish a series of, political motivations for the residents to be able to enable for themselves the development of the land during the years. And now I'm going very, very quickly so that we can have time for the conversation. But this is yet another project that answers also to the way in which Christina was asking the panelists in the previous session, what keeps you excited and what keeps you active? Well, for us, has been this project in Sao Paulo. Obviously, as you can imagine, with COVID, a lot of the work has been happening remotely, have been happening digitally, but much of what we have been doing since 2016 has been able to continue. In Sao Paulo, we have been focusing on work in the southern periphery of the city. And here we are also tracking processes of creation of urban land through insurgent means. These are citizens taking on their own hands the urbanization of the land and the incremental implementation of services. As you can imagine, the level of precarity of some of these areas from all the possible imaginations that we have of informality in the global south, land occupations are perhaps some of the most vulnerable to not only climate risks, but actually policy-driven and the very legal system. So what we have been doing through this participatory research action project has been working with communities, learning from them and co-producing a series of strategies that is enabling them to negotiate the conflict in between housing, the right to adequate housing, and the right to a healthy environment. As you can imagine, when these occupations happen is normally with vacant land with environmental value or environmental risks is still part of the available stock for development in the city. And much of what this work is doing is a large collaboration with activists, policymakers, academic institutions, and the very dwellers of these areas. Is actually trying to put in common many of the strategies that consolidated favelas, consolidated informal areas have been able to develop over the years so that these younger occupations can actually learn and can actually develop the mechanisms, the necessary mechanisms and their necessary political formation to be able to continue their own struggle for the land. And what we observe is that despite of the Brazilian constitution being one of the most incredibly progressive in terms of decoupling notions of property and ownership and tenure, the right of housing is not the right to property. Nonetheless, what we see is that despite of all the incredibly progressive legislation that follow the Constitution, there continues to be a lot of work that needs to be done to be able to minimize how, understanding the right to private property, but yet understanding the right that many of these very low-income populations have to access, housing, how those can actually be negotiated better. This is, as I was telling you, work that has continued to develop during the pandemics, and is work that is happening, enabling the stories that the residents want to communicate to actually take many different lives of their own. And here is important because, as I was saying, coming from the academic world, we are always grappling with the urgency that activists and local dwellers require. And then, the slow process of publication and dissemination of the work that we struggle with in academia. And this is, also, I feel like an important conversation, also coming from the previous panel and understanding, the incredible adaptive capacities and, how fast you were discussing your capacity to accommodate to new flows. Here we also see, similar strategies in the way in which these residents are able to reach out. So the work that we have been developing during these months of the pandemic is actually culminating next week. We have an event coming together. It's all obviously going to be developed online. But this is work that is going to be bringing together many of these communities. We have been working with 14 different communities, and I'm sharing with you some of the images of previous events and previous field work that we have been doing with them. And it's in a way work that has been focusing a lot on issues as basic as the right to access to water, basically access to water as a basic human right. And this is, as I was telling you, an important moment because what we have seen is that at this very moment in time, the work that the city was able to do in order to serve many of the populations living in these informal areas have been happening through the support of some of the housing movements and the incredible popularity that they have in these territories. These are areas that are not part of any census. These are citizens that are not necessarily having access to any basic resource. And in many cases, the provision of water and sewage is something that they are doing under their own means. So what we have seen through this incredibly challenging moment of the pandemic has been the importance of these local coalitions in between these specific groups, the access that they have had to these territories, and the work that we have done from the academia has only been possible because of these partnerships, because of the access that we have had to these communities through our collaboration with the social movements. So closing again, very, very quickly, I hope I'm more or less in time. Just to, I hope this was a quick way of sharing with you how three of the projects that are in a way portraying what many other cities are in a way witnessing at this very moment. I see many of the provocations that the book is establishing in how our work needs to be happening in tandem with, with what we can enabling through policies, but at the same time, as designers, we have also the capacity to inform how those policies can actually be better articulated, how to negotiate our times with the times of the communities that we partner, how activism and design are hand in hand together. What are the mechanisms that we have to learn and develop and communicate and tell the stories that our partners without the necessary access to media and other dissemination outlets are asking us to do. And last but not least, how the many resources that we can bring to these communities are a central part of what we can contribute to. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maria. Wow, that was fantastic. Really, really provocative. So now I think we're going to turn to a series of question and answer. We're Jeanette. Sorry. We're going to kick it off with series of questions and open it up also to the students who participated in both of these publications. Sorry, I'm just trying to find my my notes here in the prompt. If you don't mind all turning your cameras on, I'm going to lead with a question, both to you, Maria, and to the rest of the students, which is, I think one thing that, in talking about these two publications and the research and the issues that kind of were overlapping between them, one question that comes up which we should step back and ask is, why as architects are we even talking about things like property or governance or, capital or the economy? Most people might think that these things are sort of, way outside the purview of, architectural practice or interests. So just kind of starting with that provocation, to you, Maria, and, hopefully the rest of the students can also chime in.
I want to hear from the students what the thoughts are, right? So, I mean, I'm happy to respond, but I feel like I've been speaking, very, very fast and very, very quickly for a while. And I'm also curious, if they want to, take the turn.
Yeah, the students, in one sense, you were led through these questions and investigations because your professors led you there. But I'm curious about how, as you investigated these other issues, like how has that, I think, stayed with you, or how has that, challenged your own conception of what it is to be an architect, or what architectural practice, can and should look like? Don't be shy.
I think I see Pietro's lips moving, but I'm not sure.
There he is.
I was actually just reading something. Yeah, I was reading a comment.
Oh,
sorry. Could you repeat the question?
I guess the question is, why as architects are we talking about property or, governance or capital or, these things that are not, I think typically seem to be, inside the kind of discourse or the profession or the training of architects?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely a sense of a responsibility, considering the sort of certain complicity that architecture has had in sort of enforcing some of the capitalist structures, and so there's that responsibility there. But I think that there's also just opportunities, like maybe architecture has sort of, it's focused in on, it hasn't quite, for a long time, it hasn't taken up those things. But there's a capacity for it, for engaging with communities when tackling certain types of development projects, and asking them what they want, challenging sort of the traditional funding models and ownership models. So yeah.
Yeah, good point. Anyone else?
Pietro, I just want to say that that's super important, because I feel your generation particularly is coming to a moment in the profession in which this tradition of the client knocking on your door with a commission is not necessarily, the way forward. I think it took us quite some time, but I feel like I'm saying your generation, and I'm referring to younger professionals that are very much understanding that this one way for sure is to maintain that approach, right? The client and a professional relationship. But at the same time, if we really want to have other kind of capillarity, if we really want to go about challenging these, legacies of a neoliberal system that has funneled resources to particular areas and completely abandoned others, if we want to start changing that, we really need to reinvent the system. How we deliver projects, how we establish partnerships, how we cultivate coalitions. And I always tell students that as important as it is that our work is accessible, and that's why, presentation of ideas matters a great deal, is the capacity to write grants, is the capacity to sit and listen, is the capacity to almost like, right? I always feel like Lola Shepherd tells this story very well, right? We need to be detectives and we need to be continuously instigating possibilities. And I feel like that is not something that was in the classroom when I was a student. And I very much see that now students are, nah, when you show big projects and fancy approaches, in many cases is like, nah, what is happening around, how. So I don't know, I think it's right on target, your comment on what this means for an opportunity to reach different publics and truly engage in this idea of the architect as a citizen, as a cultural enabler, but also as a professional that is truly enacting components of these larger commons that, once again, I feel your generation is truly, truly convinced that's the only way possible.
I see John has his hand up. Do any of the students want to respond to that? I mean, great comment, Maria. That was actually exactly where I was going.
I think I just have like a general comment in like the original question. And I think it's important that architects should be having these conversations and thinking about all the other entities that kind of cross with architecture, because these buildings exist in the public realm, and we need to take into consideration people that are going to be occupying these buildings and the ripple effect that a building or any sort of new construction can have on the public space, and its effects on the people utilizing the space, its effects on the people that were there prior to its construction. So it's part of a bigger system, and it's important to think of it as not just this isolated object that is meant to look pretty and beautiful, which I think it's easy to get in that mindset, but to think about all the economic factors that are associated with it, the social factors and the health concerns, the sustainable concerns that really do impact the overall success or failure of architecture and any new construction moving forward.
That's great. Yeah, we have to measure ourselves differently, I think. John.
Well, so I just wanted to say that one of the things that was so provocative about Maria and Alita's proposal for Treasure Island, in terms of the retail ground floor, was this notion of a new type of a framework for property ownership. And this ties exactly back into Maria's point that the drivers of architecture are as much the economics of land use development than they are, good design considerations. And I think we're at risk in this country. The ability to navigate the entitlement process is getting harder and harder, and therefore there's a consolidation of ownership, and these, much larger companies are getting bigger and bigger, and they're basically generating most of the housing in this country. I want to turn to this idea of the Baugruppen, which is something that Spur's been investigating for a while, this collective housing model that was initiated in Germany in the 1970s, when those countries identified that, wow, in 20, 30 years, our young people aren't going to be able to afford housing under the conventional housing market. So they incentivize new forms of collective development. Wondering if we could begin to investigate that in the context of ground floor. right? What was so cool about the TI proposal was thinking about that ground floor space as of necessity fulfilling its function as social infrastructure. And that may require actually a different model of ownership, of responsibility than individual property owners then being responsible, beholden to the planning department's guidelines around provision of that ground floor. And so I'm hoping that's what you're able to explore in the studios is not just architectural expression, but actually forms of ownership that actually could result in what we're hoping to achieve in terms of that space fulfilling its obligation or its potential role in terms of social infrastructure in our cities.
That's exactly what we're hoping to do this semester, John. So thanks for that pitch. I think Ben has his hand up, and yeah.
Sorry, unmuting. Yeah, well, I mean, one thing that I completely agree with what John said, and I love Baugruppen as a case study in, it is possible to do it another way, and not just like Monday morning after the revolution, like even within the highly constrained system that we're operating in, there's space for innovation that's real and on the ground. They built hundreds or thousands of these in Berlin and other cities in Germany. And thinking about the ground floor differently is really interesting too, because we tend to think of the ground floor historically as a real estate commodity that will be leased out at a certain cost per square foot. And, regardless of whether you think that's okay or not, that's kind of the reality on the ground. But what's happened is that there's, as I alluded to before, there's so much dead retail, so much empty retail. And what that does in a market context is it makes it kind of irrelevant. And you already, from an economic point of view, so you already have a situation in which developers are being forced by sort of the good intentions of planners to put retail spaces in their buildings. But the developers know, they do the math, they know that it's very low likelihood that they will get a meaningful revenue stream out of that. And they just do it because that's how you have to move the football down the field to get the building built. And they write it off in pro forma. And what that does is it creates an opening. And it's almost like a kind of economic invisibility of these spaces that creates the opportunity to do something else. And I think you even see this with smart developers who are already saying, I'm not going to think about this ground floor as a way to make money. I'm going to think of this ground floor as a way to create an experience or provide community assets or create that social infrastructure. And that will accrue to the benefit of my project economically, but it also has the potential to benefit the community and to benefit the sort of civic and social infrastructure of the city. I think that's a real opportunity, especially if, we have this whole wave of collapse of a variety of retail businesses after this year. What do we then do? What is that space of opportunity? And in that economic sort of hole in the donut, all sorts of wonderful things can happen if we can get out of our own way.
It's so interesting that you just mentioned all that, Ben, because that was exactly the thesis. That is the thesis we have at Sidewalk on what ground floor is and how it fits in with a pro forma. And I do think, as we start working with other developers, it's really interesting, zeroing out the rent revenue from ground floor, that's not easy. That's hard to do. And it's not something that an institutional investor is used to. So, but the point's true. And you have to start thinking about how you can add community and cultural space to drive foot traffic, because it'll, increase the value overall of the property. And that's where you make your money. So it is I think there's going to be some interesting sea change or something happening in terms of how real estate's underwritten because of declining ground floor values.
Jeanette.
I'm trying to figure out how to ask this question because my cat sat on my notes and I can't read them. So I try to remember my train of thought. It's so interesting. It's one common theme I'm seeing across both books and across the panel discussion and Maria's present talk today is exactly as Maria said it, this question of redefining prosperity, that when we talk about how to rethink both the ownership and access to ground floor space, and at the same time that we're talking about settlement, informal and otherwise, and land ownership and land access, I guess behind all of that is a kind of critique of that idea that one should ever follow the highest and best use, right? That one is always trying to maximize a kind of like profit and growth and all that kind of stuff, but actually to recognize that value comes from other places. And in reference to your point, Carrie, I've been wondering about, like, it's tricky because in a pandemic, it's kind of easy for people, developers, for example, to say, like, yes, let's work for social capital. Let's work for the kind of vitality of the street, because profits wouldn't necessarily motivate a different tactic, right? But then the minute retail comes back, if it ever does, or the minute the pandemic is over, if it ever ends, there's a danger to just flip back, right? In other words, there's a danger to the kind of temporariness of things. So I actually, I don't know, I guess I have a couple of questions, but one is that I thought Ben's question in the chat was really important as a way of recognizing that there's this transfer between so-called official uses and unofficial uses. And I'm seeing in Ming's talk and Maria's talk, this like all these incredibly empowered strategies in which spaces are taken over, that's in a way that's not about highest and best use. So, okay, my question is, how can we make those things less temporary? What are motives that can reasonably counter the profit motives out there?
So I will be really brief on this, but because this is something I've been working on, but one of the things that I think would be really interesting to prove is that those more informal uses, whatever they may be, are actually driving more interest and foot traffic to the site, which in turn is driving value. And you need to say driving value both in terms of the economics, but also you need to do the measures of community impact and quality of life. So it's not just about gentrification, but I think you need to do some measurement there to really assess that, because I agree. I think those temporary uses are, or not even temporary, permanent, unconventional ones are driving great value and can.
So one of the things why I've learned so much working in Brazil is because, as I was telling you, it's one of the Latin American constitutions that happened at a time in which the social movements had a very important role in writing that constitution. So out of that provision of understanding that the land has a social and ecological value, and not only an economic one, there was a cascade of legislation actually enabling that constitutional right to take shape. And again, I'm not a legal expert. I work with a lot of lawyers and a lot of legal experts that are, always a joy to listen and follow as much as I can. But one of the mechanisms, obviously, from the Ministry of Cities, from the statute of the city, to the way in which land use is starting to include those provisions. There are specific land uses that are accounting for the social value of the land or the social activities that are going to take place in there. So one of the ways in which informal areas are being protected in the city of Sao Paulo is through a particular designation of land uses called SAIs, are areas of social interest. And what that is doing is it's not perfect, because evictions are a real risk when occupations happen both in private and in public land. But these are mechanisms that residents start to use in their favor, and is all a battle of time and intelligence, and how they represent themselves with the help of also quite sophisticated, and I'm no expert in the States, but you have prosecutors, you have the legal defenders, you have all these activists and incredibly well prepared groups that are actually using the very laws to protect the rights of many of these underserved populations. So I was just typing to Benjamin that there are no one but several times in which there have been a regularization coming as a mandate from the federal government. As of now, the country is undergoing one of those moments in which in 2017, there was, I think I'm saying it right, a new regularization process open. And this is not only for these precarious neighborhoods. These are also for gated communities that are quite wealthy and in many cases are developed in areas without the right permits. So both will benefit. And of course, there is a whole debate right now because the capacities for some of those wealthy neighborhoods to represent themselves in the justice system is very, very different than the work that many of these, communities in very precarious areas need to be able to do to be able to make their case. Obviously, these are, scholars and, legal experts debating what are the limitations of, policies and then how they are applied in the courts. And that is another whole issue. But this is just to say that, yes, there are specific provisions that are happening almost like at every level. And even if private property continues to have enormous weight, there is, there is room for occupations or, informal uses that are taking place in land that is not working socially and environmentally in the ways in which it could. And in many cases, one could argue that the right to adequate housing is a social mandate. That's how many, many of these groups are actually battling part of that. In case this is, helping a little bit, I'm fascinated by your conversation and, this other very, very important set of adaptations that need to happen at the ground level. The work that we have been doing is mainly revolving around issues of housing.
We do not have a conception of a right to housing, as you can tell if you spend any time here.
Ben, did you have your hand up? You wanted to jump in?
I did. I think John was first.
Oh, okay.
I'll just go quickly. So in response to Jeanette's comment around, allocating ground floor use space for cultural uses, and then when the economy rebounds, taking it away, it's fascinating actually over the last 10 or 20 years as we've gone through cycles of economic downturn, how that's resulted actually in enormous innovation. You look at the 2008-2000 downturn in San Francisco was really the catalyst for a lot of our phase zero interim use early activation work that continues to this day. And as you trace the downturns across the globe, actually these types of innovative solutions pop up and innovative actors pop up. One of the ones I wanted to mention is in Malmo, Sweden, the Bo 01 project. Actually, there was an architectural response to this kind of uncertainty where the ground floors in this new development were designed such that they could be utilized for retail space, or if the market wasn't there to support it, they could convert to housing. And so it's a very simple, it's an architectural solution that enabled that kind of flexibility for spaces to adapt over time. Every ground floor space in new construction in San Francisco or wherever should be able to accommodate that flexibility to allow those changes over time.
Ben.
Yeah, totally agree with what John just said. And he didn't want to toot his own horn, but basically it was rebar that put practical uses on the map. So I'm going to toot it for him. Yeah. Really is sort of a shot heard around the world in a very exciting way. So I wanted to go back to this thing of the kind of like understanding the economics of the ground floor in the kind of like universe of capitalism, right? And draw a very important distinction that we need to draw between a few different scenarios. And first of all, I think part of what sets the stage for this possibility is the fact that, retail didn't just, as the studio, the inception of the studio makes very clear, retail didn't just collapse because of COVID. Retail has been in a long-term structural decline that has been accelerating, and then COVID put it on afterburners. So that's important context. So it's not necessarily with when the pressure of COVID ends, it's not like we flip back to a kind of retail paradise where suddenly all the ground floor spaces are worth lots of money. In fact, there'll be a huge hangover before we even get back to the miserable condition we were in 2 years ago. So, but that again reinforces the idea of the space of possibilities. But the distinction that I wanted to draw is there's three potential scenarios that I think of. One is kind of what Carrie was describing, which is to say the enlightened self-interest model, right? Which says we're not going to get gobs of money for our ground floor retail space. We're going to use it as a value add. We're going to use it as branding, experience, and we may not to be too dismissive, but to sort of like cook up some metrics of like social good, but fundamentally the argument that you're making is an economic one, that this will be the attractor to your project. Scenario number two is, it's still fundamental, the buildings are still fundamentally an economic profit-seeking proposition, but the ground floor is, can be a sop to a civic good, right? It's a write-off. We don't care what happens there. And as a consequence, it becomes a space of opportunity to create social infrastructure. And maybe that's with subsidy from the public sector, or maybe that's just a condition of getting the building permits or a density bonus or whatever. And then number three is the kind of like, let's stretch ourselves to think beyond the current economic scenario where the ground floor like belongs to the public and is like in a non-market condition, and the buildings in the city are the same and all of that. Which, I'm a practitioner, so I tend to think of that as a more abstract sort of academic exercise, but it's absolutely worth thinking about, and maybe it's worth pursuing. That's a different set of questions. But I think we need to draw those distinctions, because there is a difference between branding the ground floor to attract paying tenants upstairs versus using the ground floor as social and civic infrastructure. And those two things blur into one another in complex ways, but there's a big difference between an Apple store and a high-end gallery in the ground floor versus a community room and nonprofit art space. So we need to be very conscious of those distinctions, I think.
No, thank you, Ben. That's really astute. And we're going to take your third track and run with it in the studio this semester. So we'll see if we can come up with something convincing. Maria.
I actually wanted to comment on that because I thought Ben touched on what we're studying this semester, and also relating it to the two books of Designing a Just City and The Ground Floor as a larger common and how it belongs kind of to the public. So I thought all of our conversations were so interesting on how we have places that are for collective production and as services that will support all this social infrastructure, how something is kind of fixed, but it also moves and create new forms of exchange. But also in the topic of equity, how is this accessible for everyone or for different demographics and groups? And how can we start negotiating this spaces or land as like in ownership? So I thought that was another interesting topic, and how maybe are we starting to like change the system, or how this happens in ownership and housing, retail, and these new forms of production and collective uses. And yeah, I just thought that was really interesting, and like the topic of access and ownership and designing a just city. So thank you. It's really super inspiring.
Thanks, Maria. John or Jeanette, were you? John?
I don't want to keep haranguing us. Just a quick point in response to Ben's comment about the three types of subsidy of the ground floor, utilization of the ground floor. There's a hybrid model too, which was, to me, what was provoked again by Maria and Olivia's proposal for TI was that what if that 1.4 million square feet of office space in Salesforce Towers was distributed, and that revenue, that investment was distributed throughout Bay Area neighborhoods to subsidize a corporate subsidy of ground floor space for working from home, subsidized co-working space, but then part of that investment then through corporate subsidy of ground floor space also then subsidize the cultural uses, the cultural actors, the small business. So again, a hybrid model of a distributed network of co-working spaces funded by major corporations that does the job of actually cross-subsidizing the cultural uses for to support social infrastructure.
Jeanette.
I don't know if I can do this in 2 minutes, but I wanted to ask another question, especially targeted to students. Okay, so the question is about tools. Like when I think about today, I've heard entitlements, cartography, pro formas, tax returns, grids, like there's certain tools that are like on the table, right? And they're kind of between us and our partners, our collaborators and so on. So I was just curious about this from the students, given your perspectives from, generational perspectives, international perspectives, personal perspectives, what tools seem right to you? What do you connect to?
Jean G?
Oh, you can just call me Emma. I actually have a question instead of answering Janette's question.
Go ahead.
Throwing out more questions here. I think it might be covered, but I might missed it. I just wondering, since when and how the ground floor, transferring ground floor to retailing becomes so popular almost everywhere, and at a different level of residence as well. Like for high-end residents, they would transfer the ground floor to retailing, and a middle income residents community, they would transferring the ground floor to retailing as well. I just wondering since when and how that happened. And also I assume that developer developing one property, they aim to get capital gains. And what would be different for the developers if they transferring the ground floor to retailing versus transferring ground floor to art gallery, or transferring ground floor to all different other uses? I kind of can answer the questions, but I wonder how you think what the difference will make for the developer, other than different amount of money they're gonna collect from the ground floor. Maybe they will have different targeting people by transferring ground floor differently, but what else would be different for developer? So that's two of my questions.
Carrie, do you want to take that real quick, and then we should wrap up?
Sure. I think I got the first part. So the difference with different retailers and why like the decision making for a developer is about the return, is about the rent that's coming in the door. So an art gallery would bring in different rent than an Apple store, than a bank. And if you're in a place where there's maybe going to be a lot of vacancy, like when we're talking about different uses, it may make more sense actually just to have a big lobby for the apartment building, and that means the apartments can sell for more. So there's a lot of different situations that kind of and scenarios that make the math different, but essentially it's about money in the door.
Thanks, Carrie.
Yeah.
All right. Well, my gosh, this and we probably didn't answer your question completely, Emma, but we've run out of time. Unbelievably, this discussion, I think, could go on and on. It's really just blown my mind. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all, of the panelists, the contributors to the book, to both books, and especially to the students. This is really all for you all, because as Maria pointed out, you are the ones that are going to be, transforming our profession as you enter into, I think, a very different world than we started out in a year or so ago. And I think that is all for the good. So Jeanette, I don't know if you want to add anything, or if we should thank you.
Thank you guys for hosting. Great day. Really wonderful. Congratulations, students, on all the work and the wonderful publications.
Yeah, great discussion, great work.
The books are both in the chat, so if you want to access them and distribute them, please do. And this will also be recorded.
That was really fun, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for letting me pick in your work. It was really, really a joy. Thank you.
Thanks, Marie.